Brian, thank you very much for joining DGI.
Pleasure.
There's been a lot of talk about the change in GeoInt, in its role in defence and in national security. Could you tell me, how do you think in the last 10 years GeoInt has changed? What are the three main changes that it's experienced since the previous century?
Since the previous century? Well, now I'll focus on the shorter time scale. Now, I think, as others have mentioned, timeliness, the data itself, and the flexibility. If I look back to when I joined the Satellite Center down at Madrid, that was 10 years ago, and we were working off spot imagery, 10 meters or so, Indian imagery at 6 meters, but trying to answer questions that required resolutions of sub-meter. That was very difficult. The data was difficult to get hold of in a timely fashion. Again, we've just had somebody saying in fire response they were getting the picture 3 hours ago, and that wasn't good enough. We were getting it 3 weeks ago or a month ago. Again, not very useful for the guys on the ground. It was the best available at the time in the environment, but it wasn't good enough. That has changed radically, and especially over the last 3 years that you mentioned.
The EU has plenty of missions around the world. What are the main key challenges for those GIS teams that are on the ground at the moment in various locations?
Well, again, if we look back to when the EU started, 2002, thereabouts, getting into operations, nobody really expected it would take off as such. It was thought that was something NATO would look after, the EU wouldn't get involved. Then we had up Artemis in Africa, Democratic Republic of Congo, going in to help the transition period. As UN came out, EU went in, awaiting the UN to return. The biggest problem was nobody had maps of the area. And time again, we found that with the EU operations, all of a sudden we've gone from not really expecting to do any to today being in over 22 or 23 operations spread widely throughout Africa and other parts of the world. And it always comes down to the same thing. The crisis erupts in the areas you haven't got maps.
Yeah, unfortunately. My last question is about the future. How do you see GeoInt changing in the next 10 years? Long time, but give it a guess.
Well, again, we've got, just within the last few years, the explosion of satellite types. Not just the resolution of optical sensors, but the expansion of number of multispectral bands, the sensitivity of it, the non-optical systems, the radar satellites that are up. We'll be going for infrared, no doubt, thermal satellite data. All of this is getting easier to handle, easier to integrate, easier to exploit. Now that's fine at centres such as ourselves, national centres that are geared up to that. But where it really needs to go, and others at this conference have touched on it, is also enabling the guys, the end users, to exploit that data in a similar fashion. So that we centrally would be packaging foundation data, preparing the big data sets, but we need to stream that down through narrow bandwidths to guys on the ground who can then tailor it for their own needs. And I think that's going to be the biggest challenge, and we already see the signs that things are moving that way increasingly. Other data sets looking a bit further ahead, hyperspectral, well, who knows how that will affect things. But the ability to discriminate, to answer questions, I think it's going to be a very important resource.
Brian, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Absolute pleasure.